I'm delighted to have with us Professor Samer Shehata, who's an assistant professor of Arab politics at Georgetown Center for Contemporary Arab Studies. He teaches courses on Arab and Middle East politics, Islamist politics, U.S. foreign policy toward the Middle East, Egyptian politics, and many other subjects. He's the author of a newly released book titled Shop Floor Culture and Politics in Egypt, and numerous academic and policy articles about subjects such as Egyptian politics, the Muslim Brotherhood, and the elections in Egypt.
I'm sure they can read it.
That's okay. I like to say it. They can read it, but I think it's important to put it out. He's received fellowships from the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, the Carnegie Foundation, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Ford Foundation, and other institutions. Dr. Shehata holds degrees from UC Berkeley and Cambridge University, and he received a PhD in politics from Princeton University. I think a few of you are here from our teacher trip to Egypt in 2009, and Professor Shehata was our faculty guide on that trip, and it was just really wonderful, and I'm happy to have all of you back who went on the trip, and also delighted to have Dr. Shehata with us. He will be speaking on Egyptian politics from authoritarianism to revolution. Welcome, Samer Shehata.
Thank you very much. Yeah. Thank you very much. It's a bit unusual, you know, to be here speaking about this topic, because it's a topic that has fixated us for the last month or two, and it's certainly not clear what exactly the end point is, but there's certainly no doubt of its historical significance and tremendous importance, not just for Egypt, I think not just for the Arab world, but very much beyond that. So this is fluid, as they like to say, I guess, in Washington. Things are fluid. But as I said, you know, the historical significance of the events not only in Egypt, but in Tunisia, unfolding in Libya, in Bahrain, in Yemen, and possibly other places, are incredibly historically significant. And they will change the Middle East, and I think that they will change the world. There's no question about that. Let me very briefly at the beginning, just kind of give a short thumbnail sketch of I think the move from authoritarianism to revolution in Egypt, the kind of causes of that, before moving back a little bit, moving back very briefly to understand Egyptian politics and history from 1952 until the present very briefly, and then moving forward to look at some of the, in more kind of detailed way, some of the underlying political and economic causes of the January 25 Egyptian revolution, and then move to a discussion of maybe the revolution itself very briefly, and then to a discussion kind of to wrap up with what is the situation today and kind of conclusions that we can draw from all of this. I think that, you know, you don't need to attend this session to understand that there were serious political and economic underlying causes for the events in Egypt, for the events in Tunisia, and for events in, you know, throughout the Arab world. And those causes really have to do with political oppression, authoritarianism, incredible corruption, poor governance, institutions which were kind of a deformed facade of democracy as opposed to being really meaningful institutions of political participation and representation, and so on. In addition to serious economic issues having to do with unemployment, having to do with youth unemployment, having to do with poverty, having to do with increasing income inequality, and so on. And I think that there's really no question that those things, which have been the causes of revolution in the past, certainly were at play in Tunisia, were at play in Egypt, are at play in Yemen, and are likely to be in play in a number of other countries in the region, including Bahrain, Algeria, Morocco, and so on. It is remarkable, really, the extent to which the Arab world not only is a regional system, right, where events in Tunis have a profound impact on events in Cairo, where events in Gaza and in Jenin have a significant impact in Rabat, and so on. And I think it really behooves us to relearn that. Not only the recognition that there is one Arab public sphere, right, where you can watch what is going on in Libya, in Sana'a, and you can watch what is going on in Manama, in Tripoli, at least before they cut the internet and so on, but that there are also significant cultural, historical, political links between not only the people in the Arab world, but also the regimes in the Arab world. And I think that's one of the reasons why we are seeing this kind of house of cards of Arab authoritarianism fall. There's no question that, that even before this, that these regimes were intimately linked with each other in terms of cooperation against domestic political opposition, in terms of what we call regime learning, learning the lessons of authoritarianism from other neighboring states and so on, and then other types of authoritarian cooperation between these states. But that's moving a little ways ahead. Okay, let's go back now to what I'm supposed to be talking about today, which is Egyptian authoritarianism, or Egypt authoritarianism to revolution. And Zaina, you will tell me when I have like 10 minutes left or 5 minutes left or something like that, because I'm quite bad about this. Okay, so in some ways, the present political structure in Egypt, or at least the political structure that ended a week or so ago in Egypt, began not really in 1981, that is October 6, 1981, when President Mubarak, Mr. Mubarak, came to power after the assassination of Anwar Sadat, but really in 1952, in a way, which is when a group of young army officers, the free officers as they were called, staged a coup, which they called a revolution, against the monarchical regime of King Farouk, and supported by the British and so on. And the free officers, of course, were, not so much a motley crew, but young officers led by both a gentleman, Mohammed Naguib, who later became the first president of Egypt until 1954, but most notably for all of us, Gamal Abdel Nasser, who became Egypt's second president and served until 1970. And the free officers at the time didn't really have a well-developed ideology. They had 6 principles of the revolution they put forward at the time: ending British occupation, eliminating feudalism, industrialization and development, establishing social justice, building a strong national army, and setting a sound democratic system. And in fact, the free officers promised that they would go back to the barracks soon after they cleaned up the mess of Egyptian corrupt parliamentary politics and so on, established a republic, and fulfilled some of these goals, or at least set Egypt on a proper path. But of course, we know they didn't go back to the barracks, and we suffered from that really up until February 11th, was it, and so on. And hopefully we won't be suffering from that in the coming period as well. But they did undertake massive changes in Egyptian society, in Egyptian politics, and Egyptian economics. And I think they're important to understand, really, as we move forward in history, to understand what actually happened between January 25 and February 11th. They implemented land reform. Egypt was dominated by a group of kind of latifundia, a feudal class almost, that owned hundreds, if not thousands, of acres of agricultural land. It was primarily an agriculturally based economy, although there was some industrialization beginning from, beginning is a debate, from sometime in the late 19th, early 20th century. And there was unbelievable income inequality and also poverty. And this was seen as a hindrance, as a fetter on Egypt's social and economic development. And for good reasons, and also for self-interested reasons, the free officers undertook land reform in 1952 and in 1954 to eliminate the political power of this economically based social group. They also undertook significant industrialization projects, and eventually the regime moved to a kind of socialist, Arab socialist economics, as it were, where they nationalized large industries and so on as a result of all different kinds of factors which we don't need to get into right now. The point of this story, however, is really the following, is that the social bases of the regime from 1954-56, you could argue, until sometime in the 1970s, was really based on farmers, what we used to call peasants, who had received land previously, who were landless, workers who were the new beneficiaries, really, to some extent, of higher wages and at least some kind of representation in terms of a corporatist labor institution before that went downhill, and a growing kind of middle class that was employed to some extent in civil service, in the government bureaucracy, that were given free education for the first time, promises of free health care, and promises of government employment after graduation. This was the social basis of the regime, really, from 1954 until sometime in the 1970s. Who was on the outs? Capital. And certainly the West or Western powers to some extent during that period. Things began to change with Egypt's next president, Anwar Sadat, who came to power in 1970 following the premature death of Gamal Abdel Nasser in 1970. We used to be able to say that Egyptian presidents only left office when they died. Thankfully, we can't say that anymore. And the changes that were made beginning in the 1970s significantly affected the social bases of the regime, the support of the regime, the pillars of the regime. And in the early 1970s, in 1973 and 1974 in particular, Mr. Sadat undertook a kind of economic reform program called Infitah, or opening, which attempted to move Egypt from a kind of closed, socialist, inward-looking economy that was based on subsidies and large state intervention in the economy and so on, into a slightly more free market, entrepreneurial, open to the West type of economy. Now, things moved at a kind of pharaonic pace, really, in terms of these reforms in the early 1970s. And although there was some change to the Egyptian economy, certainly there wasn't significant, fast-paced move from kind of socialism to capitalism. I should also say that in the early period, up until the present, really, up until February 11th, but let's talk about the early period from 1952 to 1970, at least, with Gamal Abdel Nasser. Although there were improvements in Egypt's economy, the standard of living for many Egyptians and so on, politically, of course, it was an authoritarian state. Nasser abolished political parties. He initially dissolved parliament, the free officers did in 1952. They eventually would move to a single-party regime that eventually took the name of the Arab Socialist Union, which was the predecessor of Mr. Mubarak's party, the National Democratic Party. It was, I don't want to say a police state, but it was certainly a military society in the early period, to kind of crib the title of a famous book that was written about at the time by an Egyptian intellectual, with military officers in the early period holding most cabinet positions, most high-level administrative positions, including most positions as CEOs of the nationalized industries and so on. I don't have to remind you that Egypt, of course, suffered through a number of wars during this period. Not mention the 1948 war, but certainly the 56 war, the 67 war. People forget the War of Attrition, 69 to 1970. It was a militarized society to some extent, and it was also a society which was certainly not characterized by anything close to democracy. It was an authoritarian state in the old model, in the old-fashioned system, as it were. So President Sadat comes to power in 1970. Some significant changes take place in terms of the economy, at least a beginning move towards markets, towards economic liberalization, towards an outward orientation, towards an attempt to attract foreign capital and foreign technology. And also something interesting happens politically during the middle toward the end of the Sadat period. Sadat moves from a kind of single-party state, old-fashioned authoritarianism, to a kind of newfangled facade democracy, where multiple parties are allowed to form, where elections between competing candidates of different parties are allowed to take place, and so on. This is in the period from 1978, 75 really, and then 78 until, you know, the present. This type of regime eventually became what political scientists call semi-authoritarian, not fully authoritarian in the model of, say, Syria under Hafiz al-Assad or Bashar al-Assad or a Saddam Hussein, really, or certainly Libya, but certainly not a democracy. A regime that had the institutions of democracy, at least on paper, that is regular elections, a parliament, competing parties, NGOs, civil society, a press that was nominally free. But in practice, of course, there were serious restrictions on the ability of any of these organizations to engage in politics. To establish non-governmental organizations that were really free of government interference. Journalists were continually under threat of prosecution as a result of journalism crimes that were punishable, and still are, punishable by jail time and so on. Political parties needed licensing in order to be established, and the political parties committee was chaired by the head of the ruling National Democratic Party. You can imagine most party applications were rejected and so on. So nominally democratic, but in fact really quite far from democracy. And also, as I said, economic changes were beginning at the time. From the mid-1970s forward, that would really eventually lead to a fundamental changing of the pillars of regime support. President Sadat is assassinated. I'm jumping up very quickly here because I have limited time. President Sadat is assassinated on October 6, 1981. In 1975, he had appointed Hosni Mubarak as his vice president. Mr. Mubarak was an Air Force pilot. He later became an Air Force instructor. Then he became the head of the Air Force. And then, of course, he was appointed in 1975 as vice president. And as fate would have it, he found himself in the position of president in 1981. And, of course, he famously promised at the time that he would only serve 2 terms, unlike all previous Egyptian presidents that perpetuated themselves forever. Of course, that didn't take place, as you see. And it was a system that this kind of facade democracy or semi-authoritarian system in which the democratic institutions existed in paper but not on practice really developed further during the Nasser period. Of course, during the Mubarak period. Of course, there had always been a constitution, but there were regular parliamentary elections under Mr. Mubarak in 84, 87, 90, 95, every 5 years, basically. There were presidential, at first, referendums, because the Constitution didn't allow presidential elections. As a old holdover, Egyptians were allowed to vote yes or no in a plebiscite on the candidate that was put forward to them in a national vote that was approved by 2/3 of the members of parliament. And Mr. Mubarak won resoundingly these plebiscites in 81, 87, 93, 99, in which cases he always received above 92% of the vote. Of course, in 2005, as a result of a constitutional amendment, kind of smoke and mirrors, that's what these semi-authoritarian regimes do, he installed or allowed multi-candidate presidential elections, but of course they were neither free nor fair, and he only won the 2005 presidential election by 88% of the vote, right? So it was a kind of imperial presidency, really, by law. There were tremendous powers in the office of the president and in the person of Mr. Mubarak, as there were in the person of Mr. Sadat and Mr. Abdel Nasser. And of course, I don't need to tell you that there was tremendous speculation, especially beginning in the 1990s, that Mr. Mubarak was trying to groom his second son, his youngest son, Gamal Mubarak, for the post of the presidency. And in fact, there was a remarkable ascension of his public profile beginning in the mid-1990s. Gamal Mubarak is a graduate of the American University in Cairo, both undergraduate degree and an MBA. He then went to England and worked as an investment banker for Bank of America for 7 years, came back to Egypt in the mid-1990s. Initially, there were rumors that he was going to establish an independent, a new liberal political party. That came to nothing. And then in 2000, he joined the ruling National Democratic Party and quickly rose like a star in the ranks of the ruling National Democratic Party, eventually becoming the really number 3 in command, although probably in practice number 2 in command of that party in the recent period, as it were. And the key point that I want to make, and I've already kind of hinted at about politics in Egypt, particularly from the late 1970s until January 25th, was that, again, on paper, there were the institutions of democracy, but in fact, the actual practice of politics was significantly different, was significantly far from democratic practice. I like to say that in Egypt, authoritarianism was legal. In other words, there is a kind of legal and institutional architecture of authoritarianism in Egypt that makes it legal. And what do I mean by that? I mean that the Constitution, as I said, gave the president tremendous powers at his disposal. The Constitution did not limit presidential terms, so the president could stay in office forever. In Egypt, from 1981 and really before, there was an emergency law that was in place, that is still in place today, that gives the executive and the security forces tremendous power to detain individuals for long periods of time and to renew that detention without due process of law, that gives security forces the ability to, that gives the executive the ability to close newspapers at whim, that limits the ability of individuals to gather in terms of public gatherings, that limits significantly the ability of political parties, the legally established political parties, the 24 legally established political parties, from actually engaging in politics, from having rallies or protests or public events, as it were. So the Constitution was largely authoritarian to some extent. The emergency law also buttressed and supported authoritarianism. As I mentioned, there was something called, and there still is something called the Political Parties Committee, which parties needed to get the approval of in order to establish a political party legally. That was headed by the head of the ruling National Democratic Party. The NGO law significantly limited the ability of NGOs to operate effectively and independently from the regime. They needed licensing, and they were constantly surveilled, and the threat of them being closed down. There was a judicial authority law that limited the independence of the judicial branch of government. As I said, the press law also was certainly one that put restrictions, at least internal restrictions, on the ability of journalists to act. So there was a kind of legal and institutional architecture of authoritarianism that actually needs to be dismantled if we are to move forward. That's another issue. So what happened moving up? What happened? What were the causes, or why did the revolution happen? As I mentioned, of course, the obvious political and economic grievances, authoritarianism, regular fraudulent elections, something also kind of much more profound that is difficult to get at. And that is, there was a kind of deprivation of dignity in all dealings of Egyptian citizens with the state and with state officials, from the lowest level state official to the highest level state official, right? This kind of loss of dignity, this kind of dehumanizing aspect of not only politics, of life in Egypt, I think, also needs to be understood. And of course, there was tremendous economic dislocation, high inflation, high unemployment, and tremendously and significantly high poverty. I'll get at that in a moment in a kind of disjointed way in terms of what's happened in Egypt over the last 5 or 6 years as the attempt to move to a market economy, to implement neoliberal economic reforms, to privatize industries, to deregulate economies, to eliminate subsidies, to make Egypt market-friendly, to reform labor laws to make it easier for companies to dismiss workers and so on. As those things took place and were executed over the last 5 or 6 years, there have been tremendously negative economic consequences that the vast majority of Egyptians have faced with, despite the rosy macroeconomic indicators reported by the World Bank and Egyptian ministries about record levels of GDP growth, about record levels of foreign direct investment, about the tremendous reform Egypt has made in terms of streamlining its bureaucracy, receiving the top reformer award 2 years in a row by the IFC and so on. There's been an underside of all of this, and that's certainly one of the economic causes of what we've seen that have contributed to the grievances that really kind of facilitated the January 25 revolution. Okay, so and there are also proximate causes or very close causes to the events, right, that were kind of catalysts, as it were, to the movement of hundreds of thousands and millions of people to begin on January 25 to face the regime directly and to call for an end to Mubarak's rule and really an end to the old kind of politics in Egypt. And those proximate causes had to do with a number of things. I'll go back for a moment and just speak a little bit about the economic issues before moving to some of the proximate causes. Okay, 5 minutes. As I mentioned, really, this kind of move towards free market, so-called free market economies, which were not really free market, it was kind of characterized by crony capitalism, began in earnest in 2004 with the installation of a new cabinet in that year, a cabinet led by true believers in neoliberal economic policies, a cabinet that was dominated, at least in its economic fields, by close associates of Gamal Mubarak, of people who came from the private sector, who were linked to the National Democratic Party, and who benefited from their proximity to power for economic gain. And these individuals implemented quite vigorously, as I mentioned, privatization at a record pace, market deregulation, elimination of food and fuel subsidies, the liberalization of currency, right, the liberalization of the pound, as it were, and other policies that led to, in the period between 2004 and the present, high levels of GDP growth. Egypt received above 6% for a number of years in a row, record levels of foreign direct investment and so on. But at the same time, it led to a kind of immiserization of the vast majority of Egyptians. According to the IMF, poverty actually increased in Egypt during this period, right? As you know, Egypt suffers from 20% of the population living below poverty and another 20% of the population living close to the poverty line, which means that inflation, which was record levels during this period also, leads to people who are close to poverty falling into poverty. So the underside of the economic miracle, as it were, was increasing poverty, increasing economic inequality, record levels of inflation, which ate away at real wages, and this led to a tsunami of labor and economic protest between 2004 and the present. And I think it's impossible to understand the events of January 25 without taking that into consideration. Between 2004 and the present, we have seen in Egypt economic and labor protests, the likes of which we have not seen in the 20th century. Everyone went on strike, from textile workers to pharmacists to Egypt, even the clowns in Egypt's national circus, dressed up in their clown outfits, protesting the potential privatization of the national circus by the corrupt minister of culture who served for 20 years, as it were, and needs to be tried for his bad taste and his more grievous crimes. So there was a tsunami of labor and economic protest that certainly is part of the underlying causes of what happened. There were also some more recent events, some more proximate causes having to do with the systematic and quite regular abuse of Egyptians and torture of Egyptians in police stations. Most famously in the summer of 2009, as it were. I've forgotten because I've just been awake one long period for the last year. Is it 2009, Khaled Said? The summer of 2009, a young Egyptian in his mid to late 20s, Khaled Said, who had obtained a video of a police drug deal, as it were, was found by some police officers in a cafe in Alexandria, taken out of the cafe to the entrance of an apartment building and brutally murdered, as it were. And then, of course, they claimed that, he was involved in drugs and they planted drugs in him and so on, and the forensics report supposedly proved that. And this outrageous crime, which is really quite indicative, not a unique case, quite indicative of the way the Egyptian police operate, became a kind of national event. And of course, as you know, a web page, a Facebook page was created, Ehna Kullina Khaled Said, we are all Khaled Said. But even before that, protests, silent protests took place in Alexandria and so on. And this kind of was one of the galvanizing, not the only, but certainly one of the galvanizing forces that led to, or that was a part of the beginning of the January 25 protests. Khaled Said certainly. In November and December of 2010, Egypt held parliamentary elections, the most fraudulent parliamentary elections in Egypt's probably 20th century history, I would say, right, having witnessed many of them, including those elections firsthand. And of course, we can't understand the January 25 revolution without understanding what happened in Tunisia between December 17th with Mohammed Bouazizi's self-immolation, right? And then the fall, ultimately, of the Tunisian regime and the fleeing like a rat of Bin Ali on January the 14th to Saudi Arabia, right? This was incredibly important for Egypt and for the entire Arab world, because what it showed to Egyptians and to Yemenis and to Bahrainis and to Libyans is that political protest, hundreds of thousands of people taking to the streets to face an authoritarian regime, armed to the teeth. Bin Ali's regime was the closest thing to a police state in the Arab world. That people, peaceful protesters, could eventually bring down authoritarianism. And that was incredibly inspirational for Egyptians. It was incredibly enabling for Egyptians. And if you go back and look at the communiques and the emails and the messages that were sent out in mid-January by the National Association for Change, Mohammed al-Baradei's movement, the April 6th youth movement, and so on, they all refer to the events in Tunisia. They all say that if the Tunisians could do this, we can do this. They specifically say that. And in fact, the protests, some of the slogans initially on January 25 in Cairo were Tunis, Tunis. That's gotten forgotten now because it became quickly Egypt, Egypt. But we cannot underemphasize the importance of that. And this gets to the regional system issue that I mentioned before about how events in Tunisia can affect events in Cairo and so on. So Tunisia is very, very important. Let's see here. Okay, so let me kind of move ahead in a disjointed way, just very briefly in the minute and a half that I have left, or the negative time that I have, and speak about. There's a couple of other things that need to be mentioned as well. According to Transparency International, corruption increased in Egypt during the last 5 years, as it were, along with, I said, kind of the economic reforms, quote unquote, that were taking place. Also, according to Foreign Policy's Rule of Law Index, rule of law deteriorated in Egypt over the last couple of years as well. And anyone kind of who has spent any time in Egypt can attest to that kind of firsthand. Okay, moving to the January 25th protests that eventually led to the fall of the regime. Who organized the protests and what were the demands? The first group that organized the protests was the April 6th Youth Movement. And the April 6th Youth Movement gets its name from April 6, 2008 labor protests in Mahal al-Kubra, a gritty delta textile city that had, during this period that I mentioned before, regular, massive protests. The largest textile factory in the continent of Africa, 25,000 people, state public sector factory, held massive protests during this period, and one was planned for April 6, 2008, to protest against unpaid wages, inflation, to call for a minimum wage, to object to authoritarianism at the level of the firm by the CEO and the management and so on. And the April 6th movement was a youth group that wanted to have a national day of solidarity and strike and protest along with, in support of the textile workers in Mahal al-Kubra and so on. And they had a number of demands, including human dignity, including a healthcare system that worked, education that worked, and so on. That's the first group that organized the January 25 demonstrations. The National Association for Change, the group affiliated with Mohammed al-Baradei, right? The former director of the International Atomic Energy Agency, former Egyptian diplomat, Nobel Prize winner. And that group began about a year or so ago with Mohammed al-Baradei's return to Egypt from Vienna. And that group had a number of demands that it was working for from the beginning, including ending the state of emergency, as I mentioned earlier, complete judicial oversight of elections, allowing monitoring of elections by local NGOs and international NGOs, equal access to media for all candidates in presidential elections and otherwise, giving Egyptians who live abroad the right to vote in their consulates and in their embassies, like the Tunisians did supposedly before. The right to run for president without arbitrary restrictions and limiting presidential terms to 2 terms. And this, if I can digress for a moment, gets at, again, as I mentioned, the institutional and legal architecture of authoritarianism in Egypt. I mentioned the amendment to the Constitution in 2005 that moved Egypt supposedly from a referendum system to real elections between competing candidates. In fact, it didn't do that. The constitutional amendment was tailored, literally, and we use that word in Arabic, tailored so much to make it virtually impossible for anyone other than ruling National Democratic Party candidates to stand in elections. And that's why, according to the Constitution, Mohammed al-Baradei was not eligible to run in elections. So that was one of the demands as well. And the last demand that they had was voting by national ID as opposed to the obsolete and problem-ridden voter registration lists. The third group that participated in the January 25 protests that called for them was the Kifaya group. Kifaya means enough. And that group began in 2004 in the fall and held its first demonstration on December 12, 2004, on the steps of the High Court in Cairo to demand enough to Mubarak. And their slogans were that day, no to extension, meaning no to an extension of Mubarak's term. There weren't elections at the time, there were plebiscites at the time. No to inheritance, meaning no to the inheritance of the presidency by Gamal Mubarak, and yes to freedom. And this was a group, a kind of network of individuals of different political persuasions, left, somewhat center, a few Muslim Brotherhood elements that agreed on these basic things, and they were active in 2005 and in 2006, organizing demonstrations and protests around the elections and opposing Mr. Mubarak. And why they are historically significant is because on that day, December 12, 2004, that was the first time that a public protest occurred in which the explicit call was an end to Mubarak. Before that, it was a kind of a red line. You couldn't talk about that. You could criticize the prime minister, you could criticize a policy, but no one really dared to, publicly at least, maybe in print you could ahead of time, I think Abdul Halim Andil did previously, to challenge Mubarak directly, so an important group. And a few opposition parties also participated and called for the January 25 protests. A new party called the Democratic Front Party and the party of Ayman Noor, the Tomorrow Party. He's the gentleman who was the second leading vote getter in the 2005 presidential elections, who was subsequently imprisoned by Mr. Mubarak afterwards and so on. Who didn't participate in the January 25 protests? The Muslim Brotherhood and many of the other established political parties. I don't need to tell you about the subsequent events from January 25 until February 11. You know them all. The use of force and violence by regime security forces, water cannons, tear gas, rubber bullets, the withdrawal of the security forces, the use of thugs and plainclothes police against the protesters, the manufactured chaos by the regime against the Egyptian public, the war that it waged against Egyptians, the use of camels and horses in Tahrir Square, and so on. Let me just say that the protests took place well beyond Tahrir. That's what was covered mostly in the media. But they took place in almost all Egyptian cities, in Alexandria, in Mahal al-Kubra, in Mansoura. The Suez people are the heroes of the revolution, really. They paid the highest price, and in Alexandria, including my family, participated and so on. So again, the underlying causes I mentioned were political, were economic issues, and of course there were catalysts and triggers. I mentioned Tunisia, the Khaled Said movement, and so on. What is the situation today, briefly? As you know, Mr. Mubarak was forced to resign, not resign. He was forced to resign by the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces, which then suspended the Constitution, dissolved both houses of Parliament, has been ruling by communiques, kept the cabinet that President Mubarak put in place during the end of his term. There were some new cabinet positions announced yesterday. Set up a constitutional committee that is charged with amending 6 articles of the Constitution so that free and fair presidential elections can take place within 6 months, as it were. They're regularly scheduled for September 2011. Now, I don't trust people who wear uniforms, and particularly those who wear military uniforms. So I am I will still be skeptical with regard to the possibility of genuine democratic reform in Egypt. There has been widespread calls for the immediate formation of an interim government that is made up of a wide variety of people not associated with the previous regime and well respected, as it were, and that has, as of yet, not taken place. So what we need to look for, I think, in the coming period, and I haven't spoken about a number of things, the U.S.-Egyptian relations, Israel, the Muslim Brotherhood, a million other things that you can ask me about if you want to in the question and answer period. What we need to look for, I think, is a couple of things. Is the content of the constitutional changes that are going to be announced today, I think, or at least the final thing is going to be today. Whether the military commanders rescind the emergency law, which has been in place and which severely deforms Egyptian politics and limits political participation, whether the other institutional and legal aspects of authoritarianism that I mentioned are done away with, also leading the way to a possibility of democratic politics and so on, and other issues. But we need to kind of pay attention to those if Egypt is to genuinely move forward to a new democratic period. Thank you very much.
I'm Tunisian, American, and I'm very, very proud to be Tunisian today. And I'd like to thank you for saying that Tunisia has inspired Egypt. This is the first time that a scholar like Professor Shehata admits that Tunisia has inspired Egypt.
No, it's true, it's true.
For all the past centuries, we have suffered from a complex vis-a-vis Egypt, that Egypt has always inspired the rest of the Arab world.
You can argue that Tunisia inspired Egypt with regard to the proclamation of a first constitution as well, right? I mean, Tunisia was the first country in the Arab world to have a constitution, followed by Egypt. So that's even an inspiration from the 19th century.
But again, you are the first one who admit that. Okay. On a more serious note, I'd like to emphasize one point that the media did not really pay attention very much to it, is the issue of dignity that the Arabs went through in Tunisia or Egypt or Libya. It's a daily life. In their daily life, every Tunisian had to suffer humiliation. It didn't matter if the Tunisian was poor or well-educated or middle class or even upper class. You had to go through a cycle of humiliation daily. And that's really very important. That young man who killed himself, Bouazizi, it's not because the police agent confiscated the equipment he used to earn his daily life, but he was slapped. And that slap by a police woman, even in a country where women are relatively liberated and free, was not very well accepted and seen by the rest of the population. Not accepted at all. Not accepted at all. Not accepted at all. And this is the level of humiliation that Professor Shehata has mentioned was lost on many observers. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. Yeah. You're right. You're very right. Hopefully we can have more questions like that are very easy to answer.
Hopefully mine's easy to answer. I think in a liberal section of an ethnic section of American society, when President Obama, speaking to the nation after Mubarak resigned, was just ebullient about the moral force of nonviolence at work. I mean, he said it about half a dozen times. This rang real good in a certain segment in America. I'm wondering how they sound to Egyptian and Arab ears.
Well, I mean, you know, I think that there's a couple of ways to answer the question, and that is, you know, specifically about the idea of nonviolence, and then more generally about Mr. Obama's remarks on February the 11th, and then more generally even the Obama administration's handling not only of the situation, but its policy towards the Arab world, and then even more broadly, the history of U.S. Support for authoritarian regimes. Yeah, sure, sure. We'll stick to the nonviolence. Although I think you understand where I'm going with this, right? Yeah, I mean, I don't think anything that Mr. Obama said, you know, mattered that much, in fact, actually, on February the 11th, right? I mean, it's not about Mr. Obama, really. I mean, it was a nice speech. I congratulated the people in the National Security Council and in the administration who wrote it, you know. I thought it was, you know, very eloquent and meaningful, and he actually pronounced properly, you know, a word in Arabic. And I think very much appreciated. But it wasn't about that speech. I mean, even the administration's position with regard to Egypt evolved very, very slowly from the January 25 statement by Secretary Clinton that she believed that the government of Egypt was stable and that it was working towards address the legitimate grievances of the Egyptian people. I mean, absurd, absurd. And then a day or two later, the idea that both sides should show restraint, putting forward this absurd idea of moral equivalency between an authoritarian regime using water cannons, tear gas made in America, rubber bullets and live ammunition against peaceful protesters. What kind of moral equivalency is that, right? And that's not to mention the kind of history of support for the Egyptian regime for quite some time and other regimes in the region. So the February 11th speech was a drop in a bucket that really will need to change significantly, I think, and hopefully will in the coming period.
Thank you for this wonderful talk, Dr. Shehata. Could you comment on a demographic feature?
Sure.
Namely,
one of the things I didn't say, yeah.
the age of the protesters, the large percentage of young people living in Egypt, living there without hope in terms of jobs and so forth. But
right.
What factor does youth play here?
Sure, sure. And I apologize, I forgot to mention that. And a couple of things need to be said, right? One of the ironies, as it were, of the Egyptian situation, but of the Arab world generally, is that a huge percentage of the population is below the age of 25. In the Egyptian case, it's 50% of the population is below the age of 26, meaning that 50% of Egyptians have known no other president than Mr. Mubarak, right? The other aspect of the youth bulge, as it is called by demographers and some economists, is that it places tremendous strains on the economy. In the Egyptian case, for example, the Egyptian economy needs to produce 750,000 new jobs a year just to maintain the current levels of unemployment. That's how many new entrants to the labor market there are. And this has been a problem for decades. We can talk about issues of population growth and so on. They are partially responsible, but not completely responsible by any means. Oftentimes, discussions of population growth and so on elide or exclude a focus on the distribution of resources, and the distribution of resources is incredibly unequal. So the youth bulge, the percentage of the population below the age of 50, the economic consequences of it in terms of jobs that need to be created, and then the additional factor of not only is there high unemployment in Egypt, official figures are 10%, anyone who has visited the country even for a day knows that they're much higher, and that moreover, the percentage of unemployed people who are recent college graduates is significantly higher. So for example, in the Tunisian case, according to the World Bank, in 2009, 2010, the unemployment rate was 14.7%. People who are recent college graduates have an unemployment rate of at least 3 times that number, right, in the Tunisian case, according to the World Bank. And Egypt, it's probably similar, I would imagine, for recent graduates. So, yeah.
Good morning, Dr. Shehata. Thank you for coming. It was a really wonderful presentation. I learned a lot from you. And I have many questions, but I'm going to try to eliminate as much as I can. One of them is, what is after Mubarak? The people really revolted, and they went on the street. But is there a plan? That's one. And is there any possibilities for the Muslim Brotherhood to come and take over and will be second Iran? Everybody's talking this way. I want to have your, your input on that. And this is the first time I see the unity of the Arabs. We remember last year, Algeria and Egypt, they were really, they were most enemy because of the sport, soccer, I can't remember. Now they are united, and it's really wonderful to see that. And many others, but I just want to stop here.
Sure,
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Just very briefly, I mean, you are very right to be concerned about what comes next, right? And what I was trying to get at the end of my, rambling, disjointed talk was that there is a real fear that the end point, where we end up, is not what I want and what others want and what many want, which is a genuinely new form of politics, a politics in which there is participation, which there is accountability, which there is representation, a democratic form of politics where there is citizenship for all, and which there is an elimination of human rights abuses, abuses to people's dignity, and so on. I mean, there is a possibility I don't know how likely this is, but it is a possibility, of course, that we could end up with something deformed, something less than that, a Mubarak regime without Mubarak, perhaps. I don't think that that right now is as serious a possibility as it was, we were thinking about this theoretically 6 months ago, because, of course, hundreds of thousands and millions of people have protested, have gone to the streets, and they're able to do so again. The barrier of fear has been broken to a large extent, as is witnessed in an even more extreme case in Libya. I don't know if anyone's talked about Libya today. It's a disaster. It's an unbelievable crime against humanity, really. The use of heavy artillery and possibly even helicopter gunships against a civilian population protesting. This is outrageous. So getting back again to the question, yes, there is a possibility of a Mubarak regime without Mubarak, and that's why the revolution needs to continue. That's why the revolution needs to continue, and that's why pressure has to be put on the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces by all segments of society, so that the institutional and legal aspects of authoritarianism need to be dismantled once and for all, and a fundamentally new kind of politics needs to take shape. And so you're right, where we end up, it's not clear. But I'm, unusually optimistic for myself. That's the first question. The second question is the Muslim Brotherhood. The Muslim Brotherhood, as I mentioned, were not part of the initial January 25 demonstrations. They were by no means the majority or even a significant plurality of the demonstrations, of the protesters. The protesters encompassed all segments of society, from youth, from children, from Christians, Muslims, men, women, Upper Egypt, Sinai, the Delta, large Egyptian towns, and so on. So the Muslim Brotherhood was not behind the January 25 protests, were not the major group that demonstrated in the streets, and then moreover, the Brotherhood is an integral and a legitimate player on the Egyptian political map, as are many others, that I certainly am not threatened by, and that deserve to participate in politics, as they have been peacefully through elections. And I think there is a tremendous hysteria, unfortunately, about Islamist politics in general and about the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt in particular, and I think it's tremendously unwarranted. And in fact, if I was a betting person, I certainly wouldn't necessarily bet on the Muslim Brotherhood's prospects for doing well in upcoming parliamentary elections. They've already announced, as they have in the past, even before any of this, that they will not be nominating a candidate in the presidential elections, right? That's the first thing, so don't worry about that. The second thing is that the Brotherhood, in all of their previous electoral participation, have never nominated even close to a half of the number of seats for Parliament, and they will not do so in the coming parliamentary elections. What we will see in Egypt in the coming period is unlike anything that we've seen in the past, because in authoritarian politics, regular people do the smart thing for the most part and exit, right? Exit voice and loyalty. You don't participate. You don't go vote. You don't, protest for the most part, because there's tremendous disincentives for protest. And what we will see, hopefully, in a democratic form of politics in Egypt is regular people from a wide variety of lives participating. And that's good. And I think that minimizes the possibility of any one group, whether it's the Muslim Brotherhood or anybody else, from dominating political life. The unity of the Arabs. Well, we'll see how long it lasts, I should say. Yes, it's an interesting. Look, you can argue that there's certainly been a great deal of solidarity at the level of populations. There's no question about that. There's really no question about that. The treacherous folk were the ones who were running these regimes, and I would hope certainly that there would be, for their own national interests as well as collective interests, in order to address major issues, whether it be Palestine, whether it be the incredible history of foreign intervention in the region, that the Arab peoples and so on would be able to act collectively more effectively in order to achieve their interests, whatever they may be, interests in quotation mark. Okay. Thank you very much. Yes.